United States 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Kincaid, was divided into 3 task forces for the Leyte landing. Task Forces 78 and 79 had mostly amphibious, transport, patrol, and service vessels. Task Force 77 would protect the landings and was under Kincaid's personal command. Two groups from Task Force 77 would take part in the naval battles at Leyte Gulf. Task Group 77-2 was commanded by Rear Admiral Oldendorf. Oldendorf had 6 battleships, 5 of which were raised and repaired veterans of Pearl Harbor, 3 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Task Group 77-4 was commanded by Rear Admiral Sprague. Sprague had 18 escort carriers, 10 destroyers, and 14 destroyer escorts. Backing 7th Fleet was 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral Halsey. 3rd Fleet consisted of Task Force 38 for the Leyte operation. This task force was made up of 4 task groups with 9 heavy and 8 light carriers. Escorting the carrier force were 6 fast battleships, 7 heavy and 10 light cruisers, and 48 destroyers. Task Force 38 was commanded by Vice Admiral Mitchell. Although his superior, Admiral Halsey, retained complete tactical control. The core of the Japanese combined fleet was the carrier force of 3rd Fleet. 3rd Fleet was based in Japan's inland sea and commanded by Vice Admiral Ozawa. It consisted of 1 heavy and 5 light operational carriers, 2 battleships fitted with flight decks as hybrid carrier battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. The 5th Fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Shima and was also based in Japan. It had 1 light and 2 heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers. 2nd Fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Kurita. This fleet was based near Singapore and had 7 battleships, 11 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 19 destroyers. Land-based naval air power was provided by 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines and 2nd Air Fleet from Formosa to southern Japan. The main targets for the 4 carrier groups of Task Force 38 were the airfields on Okinawa, on Luzon, in the northern Philippines, and on Formosa, the most important staging post for Japanese air reinforcements on the way to the Philippines. The first American strike was launched against Okinawa on October the 10th. The Japanese reaction was to order Battle Plan 2 and Battle Plan 1 activated. The carriers of 3rd Fleet would stay in port. But the air groups were ordered to ready their operational planes and crews at bases in southern Japan in case they were needed. On October 11th, 2 American task groups sent fighter sweeps against Luzon. In the following 3 days, all 4 carriers concentrated their attacks on Formosa. After raiding Formosa, the Task Force 38's carrier steamed south towards Leyte to support the landings. The carriers of the Japanese Third Fleet now sortied from Japan in pursuit. In the Japanese battle plan, Third Fleet would attack with the remainder of its air groups, but its real role was to act as a decoy, luring Halsey and his fleet carriers away from Leyte Gulf. On October 22nd, the Japanese Second Fleet sortied from Brunei in 2 divisions. Force A had 5 battleships, including the Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Force C was made up of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Fifth Fleet had already sortied from Japan with 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers. Force A, Center Force, would sail north of Palawan through the Cebuyan Sea and on through the San Bernardino Strait, heading for Leyte Gulf from the northeast. Force C, Southern Force, would sail north of Mindanao through the Saragayo Strait, followed by the 3 cruisers of Fifth Fleet, and approach Leyte Gulf from the south. Meanwhile, 1st and 2nd Air Fleets and 4th Air Army would join in an all-out air attack against the Americans at Leyte on October the 24th. On the 25th, referred by the Japanese as X Day, the naval forces would attack simultaneously from the north and the south, and between them destroy the American invaders. American naval intelligence discovered that the Japanese Second Fleet had left its anchorage in Singapore, but they hadn't been able to locate it. It was 2 submarines, Ace and Darter, that succeeded in finding the Japanese force. Not only did they send a full report to 7th Fleet, they sank 2 heavy cruisers and crippled another. Darter was lost, but the Americans were alerted. Admiral Kurita's flagship was hit with 4 torpedoes and promptly sank. He had to be rescued by one of his nearby destroyers. He later transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato. Admiral Halsey launched his scout planes on the morning of the 24th. He then made preparations to launch a massive strike against the Japanese fleet. At the same time, Japanese counterattacks by aircraft from the Philippines were unleashed against the American carriers. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft broke through the American carriers' combat air patrol. However, one Japanese bomber did find its target. It scored a direct hit on the light carrier Princeton. There were a series of explosions, and its hangar deck was engulfed in flames. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion racked the carrier. She lost over 300 sailors before slipping beneath the waves. By now, the battleships of Japanese Force A were just about to enter the Cebuyan Sea. Of Task Force 38's 4 groups, Task Group 1, which had earlier been ordered back to base to replenish, was ordered to turn around and rejoin the force. Group 3 was to the north and had just borne the brunt of the Japanese air attacks. However, Task Groups 2 and 4 were well placed to attack the Japanese in the Sibuyan Sea. At 09:10 on the morning of October 24th, Task Group 2 launched the first of 3 strike waves, followed by another launched from Task Group 4. A total of 259 sorties were flown. As the Americans attacked the massive Japanese fleet, they met a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Japanese air commanders on the Philippines had chosen to attack the American carriers rather than protect Admiral Kurita's center force. The giant battleship Musashi was hit with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Her sister ship Yamato was hit by 2 bombs. While the Yamato steamed on, the Musashi sank, the first Japanese battleship to be sunk entirely by aircraft. One of the heavy cruisers was so badly damaged it had to return to base. Having sunk the Musashi and badly damaged the heavy cruiser, the American pilots greatly overestimated the damage they had inflicted on the Japanese. They believed they had completely neutralized the enemy fleet. When Admiral Kurita turned his fleet around to get out of range of the American aircraft, Admiral Halsey concluded that fleet was no longer a threat to the American forces at Leyte. By the morning of October 24th, the Japanese carriers of 3rd Fleet were off northern Luzon. This fleet had not been detected by the Americans. Admiral Ozawa's intention was to strike with the few aircraft that he had left, and then try to lure the American carriers after them. At 11:15, Ozawa's scout plane found the carriers of Task Group 3. 76 planes were launched to strike the Americans. It was the last strike ever launched by Japanese carrier aircraft in World War II. Almost all of the attacking aircraft were intercepted by American fighters, and many were shot down. Only a few of the Japanese planes broke through to launch their bombs and torpedoes. They failed to hit a single ship. Task Group 3 finally located his main fleet by late that afternoon. Admiral Halsey ordered Task Groups 2 and 4 to join Group 3 and steam north. There was a discussion of a plan to guard the San Bernardino Strait with Task Force 34, but the plan was never put into effect. Instead, the ships raced north. Not a single American warship was left guarding the passage. Earlier, if Force A could turn once, it could turn again, and turn it had. Center Force, with its 4 surviving battleships, had left the Sibuyan Sea and was poised to pass through the San Bernardino Strait. It completed the passage in the early hours of October 25th. Meanwhile, to the south, Force C with its 2 battleships was off Mindanao. Behind followed the cruisers of 5th Fleet. Although the Americans were unaware of the Japanese pincer movement, their aircraft had located Force C. They were now sure that an attempt was about to be made to reach Leyte Gulf through the Sargasso Strait. The American battle line would be made up of 6 battleships, which would steam east and west across the Sargasso Strait. To the north was placed a column of 6 destroyers, Destroyer Division X-Ray, to guard against enemy submarines. front of the battleships were placed two groups of cruisers, right and left flank. The left flank cruisers were screened by 9 destroyers of Squadron 56. The right flank destroyers were 6 destroyers of Squadron 24. A picket of 7 destroyers from Squadron 54 was operating on both sides of Hebusan Island. If the Japanese approached up the strait, Rear Admiral Oldendorf would execute the classic naval maneuver of crossing the T. The highest tactical ambition of any fleet commander. The American battle line would be able to fire full broadsides, while the enemy would be unable to bring all of its guns to bear. 7th Fleet had to rely heavily on information from 13 groups of radar-equipped torpedo patrol boats, 39 boats in all. The PT boats made their first contact with the Japanese fleet at 22:50. For the next 4 hours, they launched one frenzied torpedo attack after another. At the cost of 1 torpedo boat, a constant stream of reports reached the waiting American warships. As it entered the Surigao Strait, the 4th Sea was sailing with the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, and the cruiser Mogami in column, with 4 destroyers as a screen ahead. Destroyer Squadron 54 attacked in 2 groups. The first section raced down the strait and launched its torpedoes at 0300, hitting the battleship Fuso, which fell out of formation, sinking. 9 minutes later, the second section launched its torpedoes. 3 of the Japanese destroyers and the battleship Yamashiro were hit. 2 of the destroyers were sinking, and all 3 were knocked out of the fight. The Yamashiro continued to steam on. 47 torpedoes had been fired by the first 2 destroyer groups. The Japanese column was now reduced to the battleship Yamashiro, the cruiser Mogami, and the destroyer Shigure. 5 Japanese ships had been hit, of which 3 had been sunk or were sinking. The Yamashiro was hit again, twice, and another destroyer was sunk. Meanwhile, the guns of the American cruisers and battleships, 64 of them, prepared to fire on the approaching Japanese column. The first American ships to open up were the right and left flank cruisers. Of the battleships, those with the latest radar fired first. The West Virginia at 0316, the Tennessee and California at 0355, followed by the Maryland and Pennsylvania. Overwhelmed by the storm of fire, the Mogami and Yamashiro took hit after hit. The Mississippi only fired once in the battle line action, a full salvo of 12 14-inch shells. This would be the last salvo ever fired by a battleship against another battleship in history. 5 minutes after the American line had opened up, both Japanese ships were ablaze and slowly retreating. At 0405, the battleship Yamashiro was struck by a torpedo, and at 0419 she capsized and sank, taking with her the commander of Southern Force, Admiral Nishimura. Only the blazing cruiser Mogami and 2 destroyers, 1 badly damaged, were able to retreat back down the Surigao Strait. During the night, the cruisers of 5th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Shima, was now finally entering the Surigao Strait. A torpedo boat made a run on one of its light cruisers and put a torpedo into her, knocking her out of formation. Admiral Shima's remaining 2 heavy cruisers and 8 destroyers then encountered the withdrawing remnants of 4th Sea. Upon seeing the damaged ships, he ordered a full retreat. The Americans at Leyte were still assuming that Admiral Halsey had left the battleships and cruisers of Task Force 34 guarding the passage. At 4 a.m. on the morning of the 25th, Admiral Kincaid sent a message to Halsey asking him to confirm that Task Force 34 was on station. However, the message was not received until 7 a.m., and by then it would be far too late. Admiral Kurita's battle force was now steaming straight for the escort carriers of 7th Fleet. The escort or jeep carriers that stood between Admiral Kurita's battleships of Force A and the American invasion fleet at Leyte were in two groups off the island of Samar. Their call signs were Taffy 3 and Taffy 2. Further to the south was a third group, Taffy 1. While much of the shore bombardment force was chasing the retreating Japanese after the battle in the Surigao Strait, it was an anti-submarine patrol plane from Taffy 2 that sighted the Japanese fleet only 20 miles from Taffy 3's position. The aircraft immediately radioed its report to the carriers. The time was 06:47. Almost at the same time that the American patrol plane reported the massive Japanese force, the two fleets came inside of each other. Admiral Kurita ordered a general attack without waiting to form a battle line. The result was chaos, with the Japanese ships racing piecemeal towards the American carriers. Taffy 3's commander, Rear Admiral Sprague, immediately made a course change into the wind and ordered all planes to launch. Every ship was to make smoke, and all carriers increased speed to flank. At a range of 19 miles, the Japanese big guns opened up. The only hope for the American jeep carriers was to turn and run for it. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and nearby Taffy 2, armed only with depth charges and rockets, were launched immediately, attacking with all they could and with all they had. Taffy 3's screening force of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts laid a screen of real and chemical smoke, then bore in on a suicide attack against the Japanese cruisers and battleships. Destroyers' torpedoes knocked out a Japanese heavy cruiser, forcing the Japanese ships into erratic evasive maneuvers. However, at 07:50, the carrier Kalinin Bay took the first of 14 enemy shells, and at 8:10, Gambia Bay dropped out of the formation, listing heavily. Hit again and again, within 30 minutes, she was dead in the water and sinking. By now, American bombs, torpedoes, and gunfire from the carriers and destroyers had badly damaged or sunk 4 of the Japanese heavy cruisers. The Japanese fleet was in utter disarray, and Admiral Kurita had completely lost tactical control. At 09:25, he abruptly broke off the fight and gave the order: all ships, my course north, speed 20 knots. Kurita had earlier intercepted the American pleas for help and feared that the American reinforcements would soon arrive. He had also received a message from Luzon warning incorrectly that an enemy force was approaching from the north. He also knew that his fleet was alone after receiving news of the disaster in the Surigao Strait. Intending to engage the non-existent enemy to the north, he ordered his fleet back toward the San Bernardino Strait. The Americans had lost 1 escort carrier and 3 of its destroyers. Earlier that day, Taffy 1 to the south was hit by the first kamikaze suicide attacks of the war. The kamikazes were composed of 24 volunteer pilots from Japan's 201st Navy Air Group, targeting and damaging 2 escort carriers. Now, Taffy 2 was the next target. Less than 2 hours after the end of the battle off Samar, the escort carrier Kitkun Bay was hit by a kamikaze. Another hit San Lo, bursting through the flight deck and detonating torpedoes and bombs. Blazing from stem to stern, San Lo went down at 11:25. A handful of pilots, willing to die, had achieved more than all of the big guns of Admiral Kurita's battle fleet. While 7th Fleet's escort carriers were under attack, Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 had caught the Japanese decoy force off Cape Engano. Halsey still believed that Admiral Ozawa's impotent force was a full-scale Japanese carrier fleet. Starting at 0800, Halsey launched 6 powerful airstrikes. The Japanese maneuvered to receive the assault with intense anti-aircraft fire. As the bombers and torpedo planes went in, the escort fighters destroyed the Japanese combat air patrols of about 30 planes by late afternoon. The 4 carriers, including the Zuikaku, the last remaining carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, had been sunk. Although Admiral Ozawa escaped, his 3rd Fleet was all but eliminated. After this battle, its surface forces became strictly an auxiliary force, with most of the remaining ships almost entirely inactive for the remainder of the war.